Survival. I'm your host, Tara Reade. It is Thanksgiving weekend in the USA. However, I am in Moscow, Russia. So today, instead of celebrating a very odd day, which really should be called the Indigenous Day, considering how much damage the US did in history to Indigenous peoples, I think there should be a lot of reflection in the US right now, considering what's going on in the Gaza Strip to Palestinians. Particularly the way they have been slaughtered. And we're going to have a very serious conversation about that and the Israel war crimes and what's happening and if there's a ceasefire, and also what's happening in Ukraine as well in the proxy war the US and NATO is fighting against Russia via Ukraine. There's been a lot of violence and a lot of endless wars under the Biden administration. And this Thanksgiving in the USA, I'm sure many citizens are hoping for peace and to not be funding violent wars and that are killing civilians and children. And I know that they have made their presence known worldwide, demonstrating for peace. And also in the polls, 70% do not approve of Joe Biden and the administration at this point. And pretty soon, as the election year continues, it's going to be hard for them to ignore cold, hard facts unless they're planning to just steal the election again. So with me today, I have someone who's a really good geopolitical analyst who's been doing this for a long time. He hails from Syria. He lives in Germany and Europe. His name is Kevork Almassian. He is the founder of the Syriana Analysis, as well as a podcast. And he'll tell you more about himself and his background. But first, we want to kind of talk about an update on what's going on and if there is a ceasefire from Israel committing its atrocities on the Palestinian people. Welcome, Kevork, to the show.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for having me. It's a really pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, thank you. So, we're looking at first they said today was going to be a ceasefire, that Israel was going to cease all that and that there was going to be some sort of a hostage exchange. And a lot of Americans and Europeans do not know that Israel has a lot of Palestinian women and children and as well and civilians in prison and have been hostages as well. And so that there's a hostage exchange even being talked about. So could you go into a little bit about what's happening and where the ceasefire is now from the latest?
Actually, they agreed with the mediation of Qatar for cessation of hostilities for 4 days. I think it will start on Friday, and both sides will exchange some hostages. From the Israeli side, the numbers are still varying depending on the sources. Some sources say 150 Palestinian hostages. Other sources say around 400 Palestinian hostages that Israel must release from the prisons. People have to know that there are thousands of Palestinians. The numbers are around 5,000 Palestinians are held hostages in Israeli prisons, and I call them hostages because there are no proper judicial procedures for these people to be in prison to begin with, and many of them haven't received any sentences. They are in administrative courts, and they call it in administrative processes, and some of them are in military courts. And in the occupied territories, for example, let's speak about the West Bank. If you are from the West Bank, which is designated as a Palestinian territory under international law, if you are a child, you are 10 years old, and you threw a stone on an Israeli occupation soldier or an occupation tank or any vehicle, you could receive up to 20 years in jail in Israeli prisons. So Israel doesn't have the right to defend itself on Palestinian territories. If we're speaking about the West Bank, if we're speaking about East Jerusalem, they don't have the right to defend themselves. They're occupation forces. And this was clear by the UN rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territories, and she defined what self-defense means. Israel has the right, according to international law, to defend itself under territories designated as Israeli territories if Palestinians attack them on these territories. But as long as they're an occupation force, and we're speaking purely international law and UN Security Council resolutions, means Israel has to withdraw to the line of the 4th June 1967 war. After 1967 war, Israel occupied large swath of territories from Syria, from Palestine, from Lebanon, and back then also from Egypt. Egypt restored its Sinai due to the accords that were agreed upon between the both sides. Syria didn't restore its Golan Heights. Lebanese still have to restore their Shab'a farms. And on the Palestinian territories, even though Israel technically withdrew from some of these territories, but practically speaking, what they do is slowly grabbing these territories through the establishment or the construction of illegal settlements. The United States says these settlements are illegal. The European Union says the settlements are illegal. The UN says the settlements are illegal, but nobody can stop the construction of the settlements. So you have hundreds of thousands of new settlers came after 67 war, and they are living on Palestinian territories, and they have arms, and they are armed to teeth, and they are backed by the Israeli police and Israeli army. And they can just shoot and kill any Palestinian without receiving any sentence. And this has happened so many times there. Therefore, when the Palestinians try to defend themselves, this time because according to international law, they have the right to defend themselves on their territories, with a stone, they could receive 20 years in jail. And that's why we have hundreds of kids in in Israeli jails, without any proper judicial system. And sorry to say, Israel doesn't have the right to prosecute Palestinians and hold them from Palestinian territories, take them to Israeli courts, and send them to jails there. This is all illegal. So Hamas, it will release now 50 hostages, which is, in my opinion, good news. And I'm very consistent in this. Women and children, they have no place in any prison, whether in Palestinian prison or in Hamas prison. These people are innocent. Okay, they shouldn't be in prison or prosecuted by any side. But the argument from the Palestinian side is, how are we going to free thousands of Palestinian hostages in Israeli jails? Israel will never give back them, never. And the experiences in the past, that Hezbollah, for example, captured 2 soldiers and then freed hundreds of hostages. Hamas, if we remember, this was 20 years ago, they captured 1 Israeli soldier and they were able to free many Palestinian hostages. So Israel proved in the past phase that the only way the Palestinians were able to free their prisoners and their hostages is through capturing Israelis. Negotiations never work. Mediations never work. Whether it's United States, whether it's Russia, whether it's Qatar, it never works. Israel would never give and free Palestinian hostages unless they want to exchange it. And that's why we have this brutal situation that Hamas waged this attack on the Israeli kibbutz, and they hold the hostages. The main goal of this operation was to hold as much as hostages they can so that they can free the Palestinian hostages. And I'm not giving justifications or excuses for Hamas. I myself am known that I dislike Hamas, and I've been attacking Hamas for quite a long time. I've been attacked by Al Jazeera because they like Hamas a lot for criticizing and attacking Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood.
Okay. I have a question. I just have a question to interject right there. To the Western audience, all right, and I'm going to give you a perspective. Hamas is called a terrorist organization. Now, you'll notice that many nations in the world are supporting Palestinians and the struggle that they are being occupied. Particularly, you have Spain, South Africa, right, that just made their motion to close down the embassy, the Israeli embassy. You have Ireland the Irish have been very outspoken because they the IRA was called a terrorist organization. And, like some of my relatives would say, absolutely not. That's not a terrorist organization. That's a resistance organization that's been fighting British colonization. They're not terrorists. They're just being labeled that by Western Empire. So is that the same thing that is happening to Hamas? Have they been labeled terrorists when they're actually a resistance group? Or is it more nuanced than that? And would you like to kind of give your take on that?
Actually, the Palestinians, since the 60s, and when they resorted to armed resistance against the Israelis, whether they are left-wing groups, whether they are Marxist groups, whether they are communist groups, whether they are socialist groups, whether they are nationalist groups, they were all called terrorists by the Israeli side. Any armed activity against the Israeli occupation were painted as terrorist activities. And we have to remember that the Islamization of the armed struggle of the Palestinians only started in the early 90s. Before that, they were mostly left-wing, communist, socialist, and sometimes nationalist. But Israel, they had a hard time in painting the Palestinians as terrorists back then. Therefore, they helped the creation of Hamas in the late 80s because they wanted to create a rift among the Palestinians. And this is from the playbook of the Brits. The Brits, they have this, they call it a brilliant idea. In the early 1920s, they supported the Muslim Brotherhood, the spawn of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, in order to create a rift in the Egyptian society among the lefties, the socialists, and the Islamists. Because back then, most of the resistance against the British occupation, and they call it a mandate of the countries in the region, they were from the left-wing scene and the nationalist scene. So they created an enemy for these resistance groups against the British occupation from the Islamists. So they started fighting each other. The same thing happened in Syria. The socialists came to power, the Pan-Arabists came to power, and they supported these Islamists to fight the other side. The same thing in Palestine. They supported the spawn of Hamas in the 80s because they wanted to first find an enemy for the PLO, an internal enemy, so that the Palestinians have their internal rift. And secondly, because it is easy by the mainstream definition that the Americans, of course, choose who is a terrorist and what is terrorism, to say that those are Islamist terrorists, for example. The definition of terrorism is the use of violence against civilian infrastructure and civilian targets in order to achieve political goals. And if we apply this on not only this Hamas, but also on other parties, the Israeli actions, the American actions, we can all call them terrorists then.
Absolutely.
Because they're always sorting
the American Empire and the British Empire. I mean, pretty much that's it. So I really wanted to make that point with you because a lot of people, the Western narrative in the media is what people read. They don't read too much into it. They just read the words and the word terrorist. And I'm so glad that you brought this up to really define it, because actually the defining force here is American is supplying a lot of money to billions of dollars to Israel, right, for weapons. And then Israel is slaughtering women and children. 70% of the people that have been murdered and bombed are women and children.
Yes.
Not terrorists. Yes. So isn't America and Israel then terrorists? So we need to look at this. I mean, because
there are different things, Sarah, here. The first thing is the timeline. And there is the media and the Americans and the Israelis want us to believe that this started on the 7th of October. This didn't start on the 7th of October. I can name countless of incidences at the beginning of the establishment of Israel by the Jewish militias who completely ethnically cleansed towns. Those are self-confessed. There are documentaries of the perpetrators speaking what they did back then in the 40s to the Palestinians, completely annihilated and burned down Palestinian towns. This didn't start on the 7th of October, but when we see what happened from the 1948 till today, yes, both sides resorted into violence. Then we can say, but both sides were aggressive, or both sides were committing this and that. But the main root of the cause of this is that the Jewish people, they used to live in Palestine in freely and in peaceful terms between with the Arabs, with the Christians, with the Muslims. There was no problem. There was no anti-Semitism in the Middle East. The anti-Semitism is an idea from Europe, and they exported it to the Middle East, and they projected it on the Middle Eastern people. this problem with the Israelis, between the Arabs and the Israelis, is not because they are Jewish people. It's because it's an occupation force. And if they were Hindu, who came to Palestine and they took somebody else's land and they made it their home, it would have been a problem between the people and the Hindu people there. And then they would have said, we have a phobia from the Hindus. No, that's not the case. The main issue, the direct issue, is that there is an occupation. Like what would be my problem as a Christian Orthodox with the Jewish people? Zero problem. I have like my very good friends are Jewish, they're anti-Zionist, and we can hang around, and there's like, we don't even speak about religion. Like, we don't care what is your religion. As long as you treat me well, I treat you well. But Israel occupies my Golan Heights, so I have a problem with the Israeli side that they occupy our territory. This is an issue of a territory. It's not about religion, but Israel tries to depict it as a religious war because they can garner international support and sympathy because of the real anti-Semitism that prevailed for centuries in Europe. And the Jewish people went through hell for centuries, and they were persecuted and they were massacred and they were ethnically cleansed. And in the 40s, millions of Jews perished because of anti-Semitism, but it wasn't us who did it. It's not our... You cannot commit the crime and then come and accuse us of being an anti-Semite. This is the issue with me.
I think a lot of people see it very sad that the oppressed are now the oppressors. And that's what's the flip has happened in history. But I wanted to ask you kind of a twofold question that includes Syria. That is the question about October 7th. So why October 7th? Now I have my theories about this, and you can agree or disagree, and we can parse that out. But there's a lot of gas reserves right off the coast of the Gaza Strip. So beyond territory, there's energy reserves worth almost $1 trillion. And you have, of course, oil reserves, not as many, but few. And then you have, of course, all the oil reserves in Syria, which America has basically just confiscated a third of the oil reserves, if that's the correct number, in Syria, and is bombing and being quite aggressive with Syria right now in just recent weeks alone. On top of that, Bibi was not very popular in Israel recently. As a few months ago, there was massive demonstrations within his own country to get him ousted. But America is very concerned, and America and Israel are quite intertwined, about the energy, economic, and all of that, and positioning also militarily of the Gaza Strip and all of the riches that are there. Plus, on the other hand, you have the East, the BRICS summit, which is moving well, and you have the Silk Road coming through, right? And so you have the East uniting and the Arabs uniting with the East, dumping the dollar, and there's a shift of wealth. So yes. Is part of this what I'm just laying out for you, or is it something different? And can you kind of explain it a little bit more?
Actually, the project of the declared goal of Israel is ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians from the Gaza Strip to Sinai. This is what they say. This is not my analysis. And why would they want every Palestinian to go there? First, to occupy the Gaza Strip. And secondly, they want to finish what they call the Palestinian issue. This is from their perspective. If you go to the charter of the Likud, they say between the river to the sea, every territory will be under the sovereignty of Israel. So they don't recognize the presence of the Palestinians and do not recognize even that there should be a Palestinian state. And when Bibi Netanyahu was in the UN General Assembly in September, he carried the map of Israel, which was all the Palestine, let's say, and it was all Israel. There was no mention of Palestine on it, and it didn't even show the let's say the map of Palestine according to the UN resolutions, for example. So he doesn't believe in a Palestinian state. And one of the reasons why they want to kick out the Palestinians from there is to have an exclusive access to the gas reserves in the Mediterranean that has been found. This was 10 to 15 years ago in the Mediterranean. The Palestinians, in all cases, they are unable to use this gas because they cannot extract it, and the Israelis do not even allow them to go 2-3 miles away from the shores of the Gaza Strip. They literally snipe people, children and kids, if they are with the boats and trying to go a few kilometers away from the shore. This is Palestinian shores, but they kill them. And it happens a lot with the fishers, etc., etc. So Israel, of course, wants to have an exclusive access to these gas fields in the Mediterranean. And similarly, in Lebanon, and there was Hezbollah said that any attempt by Israel to extract gas that belongs to the Lebanese regional water, we will bomb these companies. So with the presence of Hezbollah, Israel never dared to do that. But with the Gaza, this is the weaker, let's say, axis, the weaker circle in the axis of what is called the axis of resistance. So they're trying. If they succeed in this, of course, they will have an access to it. And similarly, in Syria, you mentioned, in Syria, there is another thing in the Golan Heights that is occupied by the Israelis. They're already extracting the energy from there that they have found recently. And I think they gave an exclusive access to the Brits and to the Americans, and they're extracting the oil. Similarly, on the eastern shore of the Euphrates in Syria, American occupation forces looting the Syrian oil and gas fields, and they are financing their stay there and also the militias that they arm and finance and support with the revenues of the Syrian oil. They occupy 1/3 of Syria, but they occupy 50% of the oil and the fuel of Syria in this part. But one of the reasons why they also are located in the eastern shore of the Euphrates, if we see the map of Syria, one of the main reasons why there is war in Syria to begin with, this regime change war, because the Qataris, they came to Damascus and they told Bashar al-Assad, I said, look, we want to extend gas pipelines from Qatar, passes through Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, Turkey to Bulgaria. And we want to supply Europe with gas. And Bashar al-Assad looked at the map and looked at the calculations. He said, no, because if I do that, then Europe will no longer need the Russian gas. And this is in parallel, this is going to hit the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines. And I'm not going to betray my strategic ally, Russia, and I'm going to say no. And they tried to convince him, persuade him, bribe him with billions of dollars. There are trillions of dollars of projects, right? And he said no. And in 2011, Qatar and Turkey, they were very close friends of Syria. And why did they all of a sudden turn against Syria? Because of this project, because they wanted for this pipeline and for these gas pipelines to come from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, Turkey to Bulgaria. And when Assad said no, they all came to destroy Syria and to occupy Syria and to remove Assad from power. And if we see now what is happening in Ukraine and try to draw parallels with what happened to Syria, we will see that one of the reasons why NATO wanted to expand to Ukraine is also because they wanted to stop the pipelines of Russia that is extending from Russia to Europe, and accordingly they blew up the Nord Stream pipelines. Nobody can convince me that this was done by the Ukrainian officer or Ukrainian intelligence. It was done by the American planning, American equipment, American conduction and everything. But they're trying now to push Ukraine under the bus. So they want to find some victim to blame him in this regard, that it was not us, it was them. Like they're trying to do now with Bibi Netanyahu. Mm-hmm. After all these deaths, they're going to push him under the bus and they're going just to blame him and say this was Bibi Netanyahu. But no, this is not going to end like this. If the Americans want to do that, it's their, okay, you do it, but we do what we have to do. And I think when this war is over, we should never stop. We should, every single Israeli official, senior or junior, they should feel worried of visiting outside world, because what they have done, they said, we want to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians. And what they're doing there, if you see the military, if anyone understands any military affairs, in Ukraine, when they said we want to do counteroffensive, we told them, you cannot win this counteroffensive because you don't have an artillery power and you don't have an air force. And the Russians, when they occupied the eastern part of Ukraine and they included it into the Russian Federation, they built fortifications 2 to 3 fortifications, and they mined everywhere. So the Ukrainian side, they needed artillery power and air force. In the Gaza Strip, it's a completely different scene. It's an urban warfare. So the Israelis do not need to carpet bomb all the buildings, all the schools, all the hospitals, every road, every moving animal there in order to advance in the Gaza Strip, because their enemy, Hamas, is fighting a guerrilla warfare, and they are fighting under the ground. They have their tunnels, they have their bunkers, they go up and they fight. So the only way to fight Hamas is to go and wage a ground offensive. But Israel, for 2 weeks and more, 20 days, carpet bombed entire northern Gaza. Why? Because they wanted to push the Palestinians to the south. And when they arrived to the south, after killing, of course, 14,000 people of them, now they're saying, oh, we will start our operations now in the south. Why do they want to start the operation to the south? Because they want to push them to the Sinai, to Egypt. But the regional powers, they were very clear. They told Antony Blinken, they told Joe Biden, this is a red line, and we will consider it an act of war. Egypt, despite its pro-American sometimes stances, they said this is an act of war. We're not going to accept it. And if you want to push 2 million Palestinians, we will consider it a war against Egypt, and we will intervene. Because you know what's going to happen if they push 2 million Palestinians there? 2 million Palestinians to the deserts, jobless, hopeless, full of hard feelings. They want to take revenge. What do you think would happen to all these people there in desperation? Do you think that they will all of a sudden develop and prosper and build their factories and stuff? No. They're going to live in dire situation in the desert, in under the tents. So of course they will try to carry arms and go and try to liberate their territory, which is in the Gaza Strip. And if they try to do that, Israel is going to say, now there is a security threat coming from the Sinai, then I have to go to Sinai and create another buffer zone, like they already occupied the Sinai in 1967 war, and like they did with Syria, with the Golan Heights. Why do they occupy the Golan Heights? In the justification, we want to create a buffer zone between us and Syria. So they're going to do the same with Egypt, and the Egyptians know this. They're not stupid, so they're not going to allow it to happen.
That's so interesting, and I'm so glad you gave out some historical contextual visuals for people who really don't get it, around what Egypt, because basically people are saying, well, why wouldn't Egypt just take? Of course, and this is the reason why. But I wanted to go a little bit deeper too on this, because right now we're facing probably a ceasefire. Now, I had said about a month ago that I thought, it was my personal opinion, just watching everything that was happening, that the U.S. wanted a wider regional war with Iran, a direct conflict,
Yes.
hot war with Iran. So where does Iran play into all of this? And now that we might have this very brief ceasefire, like for 4 days, that's not very long. What does it mean? And what do you see coming in the future right now?
The US sent lots of soldiers to the region and special forces. They sent warships, they sent aircraft carriers, they sent nuclear submarines to deter Iran. But at the same time, we have to understand that it is also Iran that is deterring the United States from directly intervening now in this conflict. The United States, if we want to speak about the United States in 2002, and if we want to say it is 2002 and this similar conflict is happening, nobody would have dared to challenge the United States. It was on the peak of its strength as a superpower. Now the United States is a declining empire, and everybody understands that. Even the Saudis, who are like historically always revolving under the umbrella of the Americans, they are moving to the east. They are striking deals with China, and they are going to deal with China in Yuan in the next 3 years in the fuel business, because China is the biggest importer of the Saudi fuel, and they're going to deal in yuan for 3 years. This is the de-dollarization that we're speaking about. So Iran is a balancing force in the region. You like Iran, you dislike Iran, that's something else. I'm speaking geopolitically. The presence of Iran right now deters American intervention, direct intervention. And the American presence also deters Iranian intervention. So in my estimation, if there is going to be an expansion of war, the first thing we will see is the intervention of Hezbollah in this conflict. And it's not going to be, as people expect, just firing some rockets. No, there's going to be ground invasion from the Hezbollah side on northern Israel, and they will occupy the kibbutzes, and they will try to go and reach to Haifa. This is in my estimation. And also we could see Yemeni more bombardment of the Israeli targets. We could see rockets coming from the Syrian side. So it is not in the interest of the Americans now to expand this war. If you are an American decision maker and you're putting the map in front of you and you're checking your balances and the pros and cons and everything, you will see that it's not in the interest of the Americans to go into regional war. But we always have to take into consideration that the people who are in charge in Washington, D.C. are not sane people. They are they are criminal psychopaths, and they could miscalculate, and they could send the entire region into an annihilation.
They're mad.
And this is,
you're saying, yeah, they are, truly are. And I know some of them. So, I mean, I've seen them with their, mics off, if you will, when, in DC. I think
Netanyahu wants escalation. I think it's his only way out of this, because he said, I want to annihilate Hamas, I want to remove them from Gaza. He's not going to do that. He's unable to do that. The only way to completely finish on the Palestinians in his mind is to bring the Americans into direct intervention in this conflict. And in order to do that, he has to provoke Hezbollah. He has to expand the war to Lebanon so that Hezbollah intervenes. Remember what happened on Wednesday. Israel assassinated and killed the son of one of the Hezbollah MPs in southern Lebanon. So they're provoking Hezbollah into emotional reactions. And if that happens and the war expands, then the American will have to intervene, because the Israelis cannot match Hezbollah in an urban warfare and in a guerrilla warfare.
And we only have a few minutes left before our time is done, but I wanted to shift the conversation to really quickly to journalists and what they're facing, trying to report accurately. Now, my numbers might be a couple of days off, but there's approximately over 50 journalists, Palestinian journalists, that have been targeted and killed by Israeli, not just killed in bombings, but like targeted and killed, and their families killed by Israelis. So there's that. And then there's the people trying to report it in other countries that are being suppressed, being accused of, different things. And this has also been happening with the Ukraine war. You see Che Bose recently in Dublin, they had a conference. The UN ambassador to the US and the Ukrainian ambassador held a conference in Dublin and called him subversive, labeling him. He's Irish, so that'll give him problems if he tries to go back home. They label different journalists, for being on the wrong side of the empire, if you will. There are many journalists that are trying to report on, like Abby Martin, like yourself, and others that are trying to lift up the Palestinian struggle and what's really going on there and the truth. And then whole media outlets that are being, targeted and suppressed. And then, of course, horrifically, the Palestinian journalists that are killed. What is your take on watching the struggle, and have you struggled with this and being suppressed, and what this means while the empire just tries to keep everybody on narrative, suppress those voices?
The number of Palestinian journalists who were killed since the 7th of October, I think 63 now, today, as we speak. And plus we have 3 journalists in Lebanon. And the 3 of them that I knew personally, whether online or personally face-to-face. And it's a war of narratives. So if you don't hold your grip on the narrative and other people challenge it, you have to break it, right? And this is was very clear by Julian Assange when he said journalists are also war criminals if they justify these wars. And you have a huge establishment, media establishment. They are working in parallel of the political, financial, and military elites in order to pave the way for these wars or justify these crimes, right? So if someone like me comes working online and trying to show the other side of the story in this conflict and in other conflicts, it's very easy to smear him because you have the power. and you have the exclusive power over these institutions. So they can call you all sorts of names. They can commit character assassination. They can make you lose your job. They can send you to financial jail. They can do lots of things to you just because you're challenging their narrative, because they cannot counter your narrative with a narrative, because our argument is so strong, is so truthful for the general public. When you're truthful to your public, and when the public is intelligent and they can see through your eyes, they can see through your words, and they can feel that you are being honest with them, and they believe you. And when they turn on their TV and they see those talking heads reading the script, and they understand that these people are just like robots, somebody sending them the script to read. So the narrative shift is a big threat to any empire. And I'm not only exclusively speaking about the United States. Any empire, when they want to sustain their power, they have to establish certain narratives and convince the people of certain narratives. And when the others comes and challenge, they try to kill them. They try to assassinate them. They try to send them to jail. But nowadays, it's easier to exclude these voices because they can deplatform you. They can make you lose your job. They can call you an anti-Semite very quickly, and you already lost your job. You're finished. So this is the game that they are playing. We have to be careful, and we have to be truthful with our audience. And the audience are clever enough to see that we are being honest with them, and we are doing this for the sake of humanity. We're doing this to establish peace. We never called for war. Every time there was a war, we stood on the opposite side of the war, and we tried to warn the people that this empire is pursuing this war because of their financial, let's say, gains, or for geopolitical reasons, trying to educate them. And education is their biggest enemy. They don't want for the people to be educated and enlightened. And when they keep the people in darkness, they can manipulate them, and they can move them to any direction they want. And this was very, very clear, especially after the pandemic, and how they tried to turn the people against each other, your neighbor, and etc., etc. This is all very clear to me. So we have to do what we're doing and continue and become better and better and better. You have to improve ourselves all the time. And I think the future is for us. This is the future of journalism. And they're going to demise sooner or later all these talking heads on the so-called mainstream media outlets.
Well, thank you so much for all of that and all the information you've given us for our audience. And how can, for those who have questions, how can they find you, and where can they find your work?
Yeah, they can find my work on Syriana Analysis YouTube channel, or on Rumble, or on X under my personal name, Kevork Almassian. I regularly post videos and analysis on my YouTube and Rumble channel, and also on my X.
Great, thank you. All right, well, that's it for Politics of Survival. I wanted to thank everyone for being here. Thank you so much, Kevork, for all your wisdom and all your analysis. We really appreciate it. Follow Kevork, please, and let's hope as we enter into this season that there be a season of peace and justice for those who have been taken from the earth too soon and taken away. And my hope is that the American, Israeli, and British responsible for this genocide that's happened in the Gaza Strip will be held accountable in some way, and that all of the violence stops. So we must support independent